Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Dear colleagues, dear guests, my name is Amandine Crespi, and on behalf of the ULB and its Institute for European Studies, Paul Dermine, my colleague, and I would like to warmly thank you for joining the 2026 edition of our Conference in Interdisciplinary European Advanced Studies, IDEAS. So for those of you who are wondering whether IDEAS is an acronym, actually it is. Okay, so this year we are sharing findings and reflections on new paths towards prosperity in the European Union. In times of geopolitical instability, ever more expensive energy and essential goods, but scarce public resources, the politics of insecurity, decline, and fear sometimes seem to prevail. And yet, it is our task as researchers to keep on analyzing critically, but also constructively, how Europe can still take the narrow path towards a democratic reconfiguration of shared prosperity and well-being. It is surely a daunting task, but based on the panels that already took place this afternoon, I can say with confidence that the exchanges we'll have over these 3 days will be fruitful and hopefully engaging for all. There are a number of institutions and persons who made this event possible and who should be thanked from the outset. So first of all, the Prosper Network, in the framework of which this conference is organized. It's 12 constitutive member universities and the colleagues who at Dublin City University coordinate the network. Professor Federico Fabbrini, the project's principal investigator, Ian Cooper, and Charlie Halford. Yes, applause. Warwick University and the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, the historical partners of IDEAS, should also be thanked for their involvement and support. Our gratitude also goes to François Forêt and Chloé Brière, the president and the director of the Institute for European Studies, for their trust and their support, as well as to all the colleagues who have accepted to chair paper panels over these 3 days. And last but not least, this conference would not have been possible without the continuous efforts of our fantastic all-female team at the Institute for European Studies, Grazia Scocca, Amy Callio, Françoise van den Broek, Guylaine Chacha, Dominique Dambour, and Louise Rentius. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you. Before moving to the keynote speech by Professor Dawson, I would like to give the floor to Federico Fabbrini, Professor of European Law at Dublin University and the PI of the Prosper Network. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amandine, for giving me the floor and for hosting us all here. So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Federico Fabbrini. I am full professor of European law at Dublin City University, where I'm the founding director of the Brexit Institute and Dublin European Law Institute. And currently, I'm also a Fulbright Schumann Fellow in International Security at the Harvard Kennedy School. In my role as the principal investigator of the Jean Monnet Network Prosper, it is my great pleasure to say just a few opening words at the start of this conference, New Path Towards Prosperity in the European Union. First and foremost, of course, let me express my sincere gratitude to the Université Libre de Bruxelles, the Institut d'études européennes, my friends Paul Dermine, Ramona Coman, and Amandine Crespi, and all of their colleagues here at the Institute for the wonderful hospitality and the great substantive and technical work that they provided in the organization of this big event. So a big round of applause to the host, I think. Moreover, let me also extend my greetings to all the partners from the IDEAS conference and our appreciation for this joint initiative which combines in a single event both the Brussels Jean Monnet Network Prosper Conference and indeed the ULB, I think it's biannual IDEAS conference. And finally, of course, let me thank all of you, the participants from across our networks and other institutions for joining us in these 3 intense days of discussions and exchange. As some of you will know, the Jean Monnet Network Prosper is a major research policy and engagement initiative co-funded by the European Commission, which was the only winner of the 20 2024 European Commission Internal Policy Dialogue Jean Monnet Network. The network started operating on the 1st of January of last year, 1st of January 2025, and lasts for 3 years, hence until the end of 2027. The Jean Monnet Network Prosper is coordinated by my institution, Dublin City University in Ireland, and involves 11 academic partners from 11 other EU member states. Specifically, the network brings together universities from the north, south, east, and west of Europe, and because they are crucial in the functioning of our project, let me list them all here. So our partners include Central European University in Budapest, Hungary, the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, the Free University of Bolzano-Bozen in Italy, the Erasmus Universities of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, the University of Luxembourg, Université Paris-Est Créteil in France, Otto von Guericke University of Magdeburg in Germany, the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece, Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, Spain, the Jagiellonian University of Krakow, Poland, and indeed ULB here in Belgium. The Jean Monnet Network Prosper focuses on the theme of an economy that works for people. In fact, the name Prosper is itself an acronym that stands for Project to Research Opportunities to Strengthen Prosperity and Economic Resilience in Europe. As such, the network aims to study the recent transformations in the field of economic governance and to provide expert insights on crucial challenges that the European Union faces, from defense spending to the green transition, from industrial policy to the digital currency, from the MFF to regional cohesion, social inclusion, competitiveness, and growth. By design, Prosper is an interdisciplinary project that brings together legal scholars, political scientists, sociologists, and political economists, leveraging the synergies that multiple disciplines can bring to the table. Prosper is has a wide-ranging set of deliverables, and as we basically are halfway in the project, let me also take the opportunity of speaking to you today to report that we have in fact produced already a lot. We have organized 7 conferences, this one included, and hosted 6 lectures. We published 7 research papers and policy briefs and over 30 blogs, all available on the website of the project at prospernetwork.eu. We also launched a podcast series that I encourage you to listen to, and we released several public statements to influence European debates. In fact, the ambition of the project is to directly impact on policy debates, and I'm pleased to say that in almost each of our events, Prosper featured keynote speeches by top decision makers, including, among others, Mairead McGuinness, the former European Commissioner for Financial Services and Vice President of the European Parliament, Adam Bodnar, the Minister of Justice of Poland, and Jean-Claude Bonichot, former judge at the ECJ. I hope, Mark, this doesn't put too much pressure on you in terms of being the keynote speaker today, but we're really pleased you are with us today. Needless to say, none of this would be possible if it wasn't for the dedication of many people. So I want also to call out my team at DCU, Ian Cooper and Charlie Halford, who looked after the day-to-day administration. I think they deserve a round of applause again. Obviously, I want to call out all of the 11 partners that are part of the project and that contribute in multiple ways in its success. And indeed, I have to acknowledge the support we're getting from the Commission, whose funding is crucial to keep us going. At a time when Europe faces unprecedented challenges, our mission is to provide thought leadership on how to protect and promote prosperity, which together with security, I think, is a key ingredient for the success of the European integration project. And I do believe that we as scholars have a collective role to play here. So let me just conclude, also in light of my experience at Harvard, by sharing some very, very quick thoughts on the role of academia in society today, and I will end on that note. As you know, universities in many places in the Western world are under pressure from governments and public authorities, but also private organizations that threaten the independence of science, academic freedom, and the integrity of scholarly inquiry. On the other hand, however, universities should also resist, I think, questionable trends, which are sometimes fashionable in our epistemic communities, which make of identity or criticism for criticism's sake the point of our work. I think as scholar, we must be mindful of the social contract between academia and society, and also conscious of the expectation that what we do should improve the life of individuals and societies and the qualities of our laws and institutions. As such, no government can tell us what we can study or cannot study. That has to be crystal clear. However, if we don't want to lose public trust and fade into irrelevance, I think we academics cannot insulate ourselves into our ivory towers, find comfort in niche scholarly pleasures indifferent to major geopolitical developments that change our polities. And it's not enough to be just critical. We also have to be constructive and propose solutions to the problems that we identify. This is, I think, exactly the spirit that is animating the Jean Monnet Network Prosper. In fact, let me also mention that on Friday this week at noon, the network will hold a dissemination event here in Brussels at the Permanent Representation of Ireland, where we will present some of our research outputs directly to policy leaders, also in view of the incoming Irish presidency of the Council of the European Union. So I hope this engaged approach will be inspirational and will inspire some of the younger scholars who are participating in this conference from across the European Union. And I very much look forward, of course, to the keynote and indeed to the discussion and exchanges that we have in the next few days. Thank you very much for your attention, and I pass the floor to Paul.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Federico. It's now time for me to introduce the keynote speaker of this IDEAS conference. It's our greatest pleasure and an honor to welcome Professor Mark Dawson tonight. Mark does not really need an introduction, but still I will introduce him. So Mark is Professor of European Law and Governance at the Hertie School in Berlin, where he's also the co-director of the Jacques Delors Center. Mark is a lawyer. He holds a PhD in law from the European University Institute in Florence and has held many visiting positions across the world. The work of Mark, and I assume most of us are one way or the other familiar with that work, truly lies at the crossroad between law and governance, as his professorship suggests. And Mark is more particularly interested in the way EU law and EU policymaking and EU politics shape and affect one another. Among many examples, Mark has been managing between 2017 and 2022 an ERC project, Leviathan, which sought to explore the legal and political accountability structures of EU economic governance. So Mark is a lawyer, but he is a genuinely open-minded and polyvalent lawyer, and his great work really resonates across disciplinary lines. And as a clear token of this, you can just have a look at Mark's list of publications, which have appeared both in top legal journals and in top political sciences journals. The same way Mark's work has been cited by supreme jurisdictions across Europe and is also at the same time frequently mobilized by policymakers. So, as an authority in EU law and governance who speaks and engages with a diversity of intellectual communities, Mark appeared as an obvious choice to deliver the keynote of this IDEAS conference, which has from the outset been designed as an interdisciplinary event. Mark's lecture is entitled From the World of Law to the World of Coordination. It will explore the progressive marginalization and displacement of EU law in EU integration, the rise of policy coordination as an alternative model of integration, and the numerous challenges that this governance shift generates. A topic of great relevance, close to the agenda of this IDEAS conference and to the agenda of the Prosper Network. So we're all very excited to hear what you have to tell us. Mark, many thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Wow, thanks for that introduction. Thanks also to the organizers. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Listening to Federico list all the achievements and all the publications of Prosper, I'm starting to feel very unproductive, I have to say, by comparison. But it's wonderful to be here, and also I'm really looking forward to taking part in the panels and getting to know those of you who I don't know already. I'm also grateful for being given the chance to actually go back to my PhD topic. So this topic is the topic where I started my PhD that Paul mentioned at the UI. You know, that was some, believe it or not, that was some 2 decades ago. But the PhD, it's a little bit like sort of the first love, you know, sort of, it always somehow has this place in your heart. That's the positive spin in it. The negative spin is you can never quite get rid of it, sort of it follows you around. So it's a little bit like that with me in policy coordination. I've always kind of followed this debate. But what I want to try and get across to you and show to you is that there's an interesting paradox that I observe when it comes to policy coordination. So when I studied policy coordination in the 2000s, it was then called New Governance. And then it was a really kind of sexy, exciting thing, right? Tons of European lawyers, very prominent people that many of you will know, like Cornelia de Burca, like David Trubeck, like Joanne Scott. That was the topic they studied. But in reality, it was pretty irrelevant. It was kind of on the fringes of EU law and policy. Now it's really relevant, but lawyers are completely disinterested in it. So this is kind of one of the paradoxes I'm interested in exploring, and also turning a little bit on its head. So the context for me is very much a feeling of my own, an observation of my own discipline, really. So what do European lawyers think the EU is, and what do they think the mission of EU law is? I think European lawyers, and that's very much reflected in the way, for example, I teach EU law, probably the way Federico and Paul teach EU law. It's all about this, right? So the centre of EU law is the Code of Justice. The centre of the centre is this individual, Kuhn Leonards, at the bottom right. European lawyers, they're fighting the good fight, right? They're fighting against populism, against the Orban government, against erosion of migrant rights. They're utilising new doctrinal tools like Article 2 in order to mobilise against that fight. And you know, that's a kind of interesting narrative way of exploring EU law as a discipline. So I think this is how European lawyers see European law. But what is European law really? I want to argue and show you this is actually European law. It's not just these kind of glamorous legal cases about whether you can sell citizenship to Maltese government can sell citizenship to oligarchs, or whether, you know, we can have things like how we protect against ghettos in Denmark. It's also about this world of policy coordination that's far less clear-cut than the world of European law, and also involves this kind of rather boring and sometimes rather administrative process where different things are happening sequentially, and we're never quite sure who is doing what and to what purpose, right? So I really want to sort of illustrate and argue, probably this is the wrong audience I'm addressing here. This is not the classical EU law audience, but certainly it's a message that I try to get along to the EU law audience, is that this coordination world is extremely important. It's growing, and it's important for the discipline of EU law. So I'll try to get through a few different things, and you'll tell me when I need to stop going through the different things and come to an end. First of all, I want to talk about, well, why did the EU become a community of law? Why did European lawyers kind of colonize this organization in a way? Second of all, why does law no longer work in European integration? Of course, that's an overly aggrandized claim. Law does lots in European integration, but are there important current problems in European integration where European law doesn't seem to do the job or doesn't work? Thirdly, why do policymakers turn to coordination as an alternative? What is coordination? So what do I mean when I talk about the coordination world? And why is it expanding? And where do we see the coordination world expanding? And finally, I'll conclude by talking about why is this a kind of constitutional challenge, and what are some ways we can go about addressing this constitutional challenge? So these are the things that I'm going to try and do. Why then did the EU become a community of law? So I'm actually going to do something that some of the early policy coordination work also did, which is contrast the world of coordination to the world of law. And here we can start with a very conventional story, which is the story of integration through law, which is an attempt theoretically to explain why European law became so central to European integration. And I will try to use that as a bit of a template to look at the world of coordination. And integration through law focused really on three main vectors. One is the vector of actors. So as European lawyers, when European law first arises as a discipline, of course it has to operate through an act of distinction. How does it distinguish itself? It distinguishes itself through contrasting European law to international law. And why is European law different? Because European law has this quality of direct effect, right? It provides a possibility for individuals to directly enforce legal obligations in the treaty, independently of their states, as they would have to do in the course of normal international law. And of course, what is important about that doctrine of direct effect? It massively expands the range of actors who have a stake in European integration and the range of actors who can actually enforce European rules. And as a result of pursuing their own self-interest, also advance the interests of integration. As a result, European law creates mechanisms that again are important to the success of Europe as a community of law. Law in the form of legislation allows European policy to be implemented. So there's this sense in European integration that once we have, an act, a regulation, we have done something meaningful that will then be followed by other actors. But of course, the key insight of integration through law was, well, even in the absence of legislation, even where we don't have the possibility of legislation, you can do things through law that you can't do through politics, right? So you can use the direct effect of treaty provisions in areas like the single market, in areas like competition law, in order to create policy outcomes, even in the absence of legislative outcomes. And then finally, the community of law also had a certain story about legitimacy, a way in which law was trying to provide a certain normative meaning to integration. First, in a language of effectiveness, so a common vocabulary of European law is the idea of effet utile, that we use European law to achieve and bring into action the goals inscribed in the European treaties. And now, increasingly, and that's very much the work of this gentleman, a new form of legal legitimacy, an idea that European law is legitimated through the values that it protects. And of course, that's another version of integration through law. It's another idea that, well, politics itself fails to protect values. It will lead you down the path of democratic and rule of law erosion. Therefore, we need legal mechanisms to step in where political mechanisms do not. So this is classical integration through law. These three vectors allowed lawyers to colonize European integration in various ways, to people and man its institutions, to create a vocabulary, and also a pedagogy. So look at European studies programs. They're often embedded in legal pedagogy. I think, though, we see the way in which this community of law reaches its ends, and I have the feeling that sort of lawyers don't quite realize it quite yet. So why does law no longer work in integration, or at least no longer work for some policy challenges? That is because integration through law was based on certain assumptions. And largely it was based on a certain policy background that was embedded in the main things the European Union did at the time that European integration through law was established, which was the internal market, which was the creation, eliminating barriers in the area of competition and state aid. So integration through law had certain assumptions. And of course, the point that I will follow is that we have to think about whether these assumptions hold today. So one is it largely, and this is a point that the two Tories have made, is that essentially integration through law was based on the microeconomy. It wasn't based on the macroeconomy. It assumed that the main actors that EU had to regulate in the legal domain were things like individuals, firms, private actors who could use directly effective provisions because, for example, they were directly affected by the way in which the internal market works. Second of all, it assumed that EU law could be delivered through common rules that were uniform and look largely the same from one state to another. So to again go back to the basic vocabulary of EU law, how does the Code of Justice justify the doctrine of direct effect? Because it's necessary for uniformity between different states. Thirdly, it largely assumes that policy can be delivered through rules, right? I'm looking at my colleague Marcus Jackman-Fuchs in the audience. There's an assumption that upon integration through law, that it's largely rules and regulation that can achieve the goals of integration, and we don't need to achieve the goals of integration through resources, through capacity building, through having physical capacities. And lastly, it assumed that there was some kind of broad agreement on the outputs or values that European law was meant to secure. So why can European law act independently of politics? Because there's an agreement that those norms that were established within primary law in the treaty, they're norms that we're all bound to and that we all are committed to over time. Of course, the difficulty is that as the EU moves beyond, as the substance of EU policy changes, as the EU becomes about things like the Next Generation EU programme was about, as it becomes about migration challenges, it's increasingly clear that these core assumptions of integration through law, they don't hold any longer in the new world of EU law. So this is my starting point really for unpacking the world of coordination. And I'll come back to these examples a little bit later. What then is this magical coordination world? And second of all, why and where is it expanding? So let me start with the first question of the expansion of the coordination world. And here I will be relatively simplistic because I'm going to cover 35 plus years in one slide. So when we talk about economic policy coordination, which is the main area I've worked, its origins, of course, come from an historical compromise that many of you are aware of that was struck and embedded in the Maastricht Treaty between, at the time, the French and German governments, that monetary policy was to be centralized under a very hierarchical and centralized European Central Bank that would be highly independent from political competition, and a much more decentralized process of fiscal policy coordination that would largely remain with the member states. And that had two elements. First of all, this form of economic policy coordination was relatively limited in scope, so it largely revolved around a couple of numerical benchmarks that were inscribed into the treaties on debts and deficits. It was substantively, therefore, narrow, and it was meant to be a process that was largely based on persuasion, right? So how is it to be implemented? Well, it's to be implemented because we set targets, we in good faith try to achieve the targets in a different way in different states, and we conduct different forms of peer review in order to check whether other states have indeed met the overall macroeconomic goals. In the Euro crisis, and this is something we explored in the project that Paul mentioned, obviously that model was exposed. So first of all, the narrow scope of fiscal policy coordination was exposed because the very narrow numerical benchmarks proved not to be the right benchmarks, right? So if you look at two examples of states who massively suffered and were implicated in the Euro crisis, Cyprus and Spain, for example, they had no problems at that time on the deficit and debt benchmarks, but Spain had a huge problem in its housing markets, Cyprus had a huge problem in its banking sector that were not anticipated because of the narrow scope of fiscal rules. And secondly, of course, by that point, and I think even before the Euro crisis, this had become very clear, this model of mutual learning hadn't actually produced very significant compliance. Again, that's something we probably would have known if we'd looked at international relations research. States are not normally very good in these diplomatic type settings in checking each other. So what that meant was that post-Euro crisis, if you look at the way EU economic governance emerged, it became both much broader. So it was embedded in a process, the European semester, that gradually started to link more and more policy fields within its ambit. But it also became, in important ways, more intrusive, right? So we have more and more possibility of both positive and negative financial incentives that are linked to compliance within the European semester. This is a debate that we can maybe come back to, the level of compliance in the European semester. And then finally, when Next Generation EU came along, what do? Well, we create a kind of new model of European semester. One, again, that's revolving around overall EU targets with member states who have to create recovery and resilience plans, that they establish milestones, And then we link those milestones to different forms of financial conditionality. So the crucial point I want to make here is that what was meant to be a relatively narrow space of economic policy coordination has become a wider coordination space because the range of issues that are touched by economic policy have become much more wider and also much more meaningful. But what is important is that this is not just a story of economic policy coordination. Areas well beyond economic policy are taking on coordinative features. So let's talk about 3 different examples here. One is the example of coordination processes embedded in EU legislation. So it used to be that there was this kind of dichotomy, right? You either created legislation or you created a policy coordination process. Now we have EU legislation that itself is about creating different forms of policy coordination processes. We have it in the area of energy and climate. We have it in terms of the implementation of the EU's Migration Pact. We have it in terms of defence investment in the context of the SAFE regulation. So there are lots of variations between these different forms of coordination. But we see more and more this idea that coordination is embedded within legislation itself. And then secondly, we have overarching processes that are designed to safeguard values, or designed to safeguard the EU budget, like, for example, the rule of law conditionality mechanism, that sound like they're operating, again, in this world of hard law and hard obligations. But how, ultimately, is the rule of law conditionality mechanism working? It's also embedded in a coordination process. It's also embedded in processes of rule of law reporting, recommendations. There's a process of kind of negotiating, essentially, outcomes that, again, seems akin to policy coordination. And then finally, what about future challenges? So when you have the Draghi report, it's this major landmark reform. It spends sort of 80 pages diagnosing problems of European competitiveness. It then spends a couple of pages talking about how to implement those reforms. What does it suggest? Again, it basically suggests a process of policy coordination in the area of competitiveness. The same with cohesion policy. How do we reform cohesion policy? We take the RRF and the NGU process and map it onto cohesion policy. So there's this sense in which sort of, increasingly policy challenges are answered by this kind of process of setting targets, establishing plans, and linking different forms of funding conditionality to those plans that suggest that policy coordination isn't just kind of spilling out of the economic policy process, it's becoming a ubiquitous model of EU governance. That kind of leads to this question, well, why is that? Why is the coordination world expanding? And this takes us back to some of the problems with Europe as a community of law. Because coordination is being used to do things it is very hard to do with rules. And this applied in the early days of coordination, so when I first studied it back in the 2000s, but it even more applies now. So one is these policy challenges. So think about the example of the Asylum and Migration Pact, or think about the example of NGE. They simply require different treatment for different states. The level of exposure to risk in an area like migration policy is geographically determined. The way in which the COVID dynamic played out across the European area, again, it hit different states differently. Second of all, as a result, these policy challenges require building capacity. They require spending money to achieve change. You cannot simply achieve change by establishing rules and regulation, as the empowerment of Frontex shows in the migration case, or as the financial armory of the SAFE regulation and the NGU fund show. Thirdly, these are areas that involve issues of high political salience. These are issues essentially in areas like migration, fiscal policy, that are at the core of national election campaigns, and therefore where governments have much stronger incentives to resist compliance. Fourthly, they involve governing under conditions of high uncertainty, where rules have to be constantly updated. So we're dealing with areas of policy where it's not enough just to create one set of rules and think that those rules will be good for the next 5 or 10 years. Actually, we constantly have to adapt rules in relation to practice. And then finally, and we'll maybe come back to this at the end, precisely because of the high political salience of these problems, we're also dealing with areas of policy where policy objectives can easily be derailed by extensive processes of political and legal deliberation. So that is sort of one thing we always have to keep in mind. To what extent is policy coordination are we shifting towards that world for good reasons, because of the fit between the instrument and the policy challenge it's trying to address? And to what extent is it sort of for more dubious reasons, because it's a way actually of avoiding important constitutional safeguards? And I'll try to come back to that point later. So the first point I want to make, policy coordination is expanding. The second one is there are good reasons why policy coordination is expanding. The third one is to define a bit more what do we mean by the coordination world against the benchmarks of the world of law. So against the three vectors that I started with at the beginning. So as we discussed early on, law is often about the microeconomy. It's often about private actors. If we looked at the initial debates about policy coordination, again, one of the reasons why academia was so excited about new governance and policy coordination was because, again, it had a different idea about the actors relevant to European integration. So it was embedded in a discourse about participatory democracy, for example. That was why, the open method of coordination was supposed to be exciting. It was supposed to herald a more bottom-up form of policymaking. If, though, we examine the current worlds of policy coordination, so I'm talking about the NGU process, I'm talking about the way the Stability and Growth Pact works. If I knew more and were on firmer foundations, I'm not sure if the EU's migration management cycle will look much different. We're talking about a coordination world that is state-focused, that is executive-driven, and that is largely bilateral in nature. So who are the actors that are being regulated? Who are the actors being coordinated? You're not coordinating civil society. You're not coordinating some decentralized societal process. Largely, you're coordinating the prime ministers and the finance ministers in the case of economic governance, who are actually creating national plans that you're relying on as a means of dispersing funding. What that implies, of course, is that civil society involvement is pretty negligible, or it's increasingly soft and voluntary. So that the empirical work that we have, and there's even some people in this room who have done this empirical work, demonstrates sort of the limited degree to which civil society is involved in policy coordination. And of course, what that further implies is that if we look at the way in which learning is occurring in policy coordination, there is a risk in such a bilateral process, a process that's largely about coordinating the preferences of the Commission versus the preferences of the governments. There isn't room for mutual learning in that process. There is no peer review in that process. It's a 27 different processes rather than a multilateral process. So there's a very different constellation in terms of actors in the world of coordination. Secondly, though, the mechanisms of policy coordination and the coordination world look very different from those of law. So of course, what is the main mechanism in the world of law? It's rules in the form of regulations and directives, rules in the form of treaty provisions. In the coordination world, we have three main elements. Firstly, plans. This is the domain of Paul. Second of all, decisions. And third of all, money. So first, plans. Planning is ubiquitous, right? Governments have to set out how to achieve particular goals. Often these are plans based on plans. So look again at the Asylum and Migration Pact. We have an EU-level implementation plan that is then followed by a series of national-level implementation plans. And there's no expectation, not only that the way in which governments will go about achieving these goals will be similar between states, but there's also increasingly a fragmentation even at the level of goals themselves, right? So if you look at, for example, the way in which the Stability and Growth Pact has been reformed, or the post-2022-24 reforms of those rules, you even have things like different debt trajectories for different states, different levels of obligations for those different states. What that implies, of course, is that we also have decisions in the world of coordination. So we have an executive actor in the European Commission who has high discretion on whether particular targets or milestones set out in national plans have been met, but also a great deal of discretion as to whether to apply certain rules at all, right? So if we look at the practice of the Stability and Growth Pact, we have numerous examples where the escape clause of the pact was triggered. We have numerous examples where the Commission decided to deprioritize state aid enforcement because of new priorities in areas like defence and areas like industrial and green spending. Again, that sort of reflect a decisional logic, a logic that, well, actually something is such a high political priority that we will simply suspend the rules under these circumstances. And then finally, why do you follow the decisions? Of course, you might follow the decisions because you think they're the right ones. You might follow a legal normative logic in following decisions. But you also, in the world of coordination, follow decisions either because you have to, or you don't follow them because you don't have to, right? So again, if we look at the way in which the NGU has been implemented and some of the early empirical evidence on the NGU, first of all, we see very different levels of ambition, right? If you look at the Italian Recovery and Resilience Plan, it's far more rigorous than the German plan, which is not that surprising given that Italy's reliance on NGU is far greater than Germany's. But you also see some evidence in the way in which the Commission actually sanctions and enforces the NGU program of differences in treatment, right? Sort of, you know, in Jonathan Zeitlin's article on NGU, he makes the point that sort of you have much more Commission willingness to push states who are more reliant on NGU funding to achieve particular milestones than other states. So money, therefore, is the main mechanism by which decision-making is actually enforced. And then finally, how does coordination look different from law at the level of legitimacy? As we saw before, law is relying on outputs, and increasingly it's relying on values in order to bolster its legitimacy. How does this look different from the world of coordination? Here, again, there are some similarities, right? Coordination, again, is largely being legitimated by what it does, by its ability to achieve certain things like lower emissions, stronger borders, more sustainable budgets, in exactly the same way that the community of law was. It therefore is legitimated based on output legitimacy. But of course, we're dealing with very different areas of policy when we talk about output legitimacy. We're dealing with distributive areas of policy that raise questions of justice and fairness, where it's highly likely that different European societies and different parties within European societies are going to have very different views on where resources should be distributed and to what ends resources can be distributed. So it's far harder, therefore, to legitimate coordination purely on the grounds of output legitimacy without compensating with some form of input legitimacy. And to go back to the discretionary nature of coordination, to go back to the embedding of coordination in decisions, that also raises this output legitimacy problem. So how do we ensure that actors like the Commission treat states equally rather than on the basis of their size, rather than on the basis of their importance in the policy-making process? So some of the arguments made, for example, by Dan Kellerman and Tommaso Pavoni about the infringement procedure and the risks in relation to that procedure, there are also risks that we would expect in this area of policy coordination. Finally then, what kind of constitutional challenges does the world of coordination bring? And how can we address these coordination challenges? Let's go back then to the beginning. Lawyers tend to see themselves as fighting this good fight, right? That they're there to protect the EU's most important values. They're there to protect minorities. They're there to protect the embattled. They're there to ensure that the individual has a place in European integration. All of these are worthy and important objectives. My concern, though, is that insofar as they ignore the drift of EU policy from the world of rules to the world of coordination, they're fighting this good and important fight, but they're fighting it in the wrong place. They're not fighting in the place that actually affects the most EU citizens and that affects the most crucial policy challenges of our time. So in that sense, if I'm correct that coordination is expanding, if I'm correct that it's colonizing, and it's creating a new policy dynamic compared to the world of law, that produces a different task for European lawyers. You know, we're lawyers, we like to constitutionalize things. That's kind of our mission in life. So that kind of leads to the question of, well, how can we constitutionalize this coordination world? How can we link policy coordination better, both to values and the way in which values are embedded in the EU's constitutional framework, and to political legitimacy, if it's true that output legitimacy simply doesn't work in the areas of policy that are based on policy coordination. I will finish with three kind of broad tracks that might be pursued in pursuit of the constitutionalization of the coordination world, and then I'll finish because the air in this room is getting less and less and less. Let's start with politicization. If indeed coordination lives in a world of distribution, it obviously has to be accompanied by a politics of distribution, by a political process that's able to channel distributive conflicts. Yet here, the treaties create a severe problem for us. So you'd expect that basically, the more distributive a policy area, the more you would need parliaments to deliberate the stakes involved in distribution. But of course, the legal design of the EU treaties makes this the reverse. The more distributive the policy area, the more likely it is that the European Parliament will be excluded, right? We'll have, and if you look at if I were to go through in detail things like the SAFE regulation, if we were to go through in detail the NGU process, again, you would see kind of the limited role of the European Parliament in these policy processes. But probably an even more significant challenge is national parliamentary legitimacy. So again, if you read some of the documents about the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, it's constantly talking about the need for ownership. You know, fiscal rules will only stick if they're owned domestically. But how can we have significant ownership of national plans if they're never formally adopted by national parliaments? And in fact, if we create a policy process that intentionally tries to marginalize national parliaments in different ways. So the first goal of constitutionalization is a strategy of politicization. The second one is a strategy of thinking about how we can effectively implement judicial control in the coordination world. And again, this is an area where many people, and perhaps many of you, are working. But judicial control in the area of the coordination world is hampered by a number of serious barriers. So one of them is that EU law tends to operate according to a dichotomy, right? Either something is law or it's not. And if it's not, it is not of interest to us at the European courts. And one can see that if we're living in a world of coordination where the boundaries between law and non-law are blurred, that leads to significant gaps in legal protection. We also see again that the EU standing rules, the rules by which you can access the European courts, again, they were designed for a whole different set of policy challenges than the area of policy that coordination is dealing with. The good news is that we have this lady, Tamara Chapata, not just her, but others. I think you're beginning to come to terms with that, right? So we have different cases of the Court of Justice that try to close this gap. Both cases where the Court of Justice, for example, has considered and agreed that even if soft law cannot be the basis of annulment, it can be the basis of a preliminary reference procedure before the European Court of Justice, so that was one major innovation. And second of all, and this was the opinion recently of Advocate General Chapeta, was that milestones in the NGU, again, they can be used to limit the discretion of the Commission and make sure that the Commission actually abides by commitments that it's made in the legislative acts that create coordination processes. So the second element of constitutionalization is somehow closing this gap and finding a balance between over-judicialization on the one hand and a rules-free space on the other. And then finally, a third strategy, an important element of constitutionalization in my view, relates to the epistemic power of coordination. So why does coordination have power? It also has power because it's able to frame certain reforms as necessary. it's able to create a certain vocabulary of necessity around certain changes that justify these processes of policy coordination that are sometimes insulated from politics. And of course, one of the risks of that epistemic process, like any epistemic process, is that it produces quite severe biases, that it privileges certain risks over other risks. So look at, for example, the role of fiscal councils in EU economic governance. Again, it might be a good thing that national plans are assessed by fiscal councils. But of course, national fiscal plans, they don't just produce debt and fiscal risks, they produce ecological risks, they produce social risks. So again, an important element of constitutionalization is in a way going back to the participatory promise of coordination and using coordination to involve actors that can measure these risks and also can put on the EU's political agenda some of the sociological and ecological impacts of policy coordination measures. I will finish there. The basic message, the coordination world is different from the legal world, and it's expanding world. But because it's expanding, it also deserves more attention and more scrutiny and control. I hope that, I thank you very much for your attention. You could have been doing so many nice things outside in the last hour, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.